Relax and listen to the voice. Hans, my hedgehog. There was once a countryman who had money and land in plenty, but however rich he was, his happiness was still lacking in one respect. He had no children. Often, when he went into the town with the other peasants, they mocked him and asked why he had no children. At last, he became angry, and when he got home he said, "I will have a child, even if it be a hedgehog." And then his wife had a child that was a hedgehog in the upper part of his body and a boy in the lower. And when she saw the child, she was terrified and said, "See, you have brought ill luck on us." Then said the man, "What can be done now? The boy must be christened, and we shall not be able to get a godfather for him." The woman said, "And we cannot call him anything else but Hans the Hedgehog." When he was christened, the parson said, "He cannot go into any ordinary bed because of his spikes." So a little straw was put behind the stove, and Hans the Hedgehog was laid on it. His mother could not suckle him, for he would have pricked her with his quills. So he had to lay there behind the stove for 8 years, and his father was tired of him and thought, "If he would but die." He did not die, however, but remained lying there. Now it happened that there was a fair in the town, and the peasant was about to go to it, and he asked his wife what he should bring back with him for her. "A little meat and a couple of white rolls which are wanted for the house," said she. Then he asked the servant, and she wanted a pair of slippers and some stockings with clocks. At last he said also, "And what will you have, Hans, my hedgehog?" "Dear father, do go to the forge and get the cockshod, and then I will ride away and never come back again." At this, the father was delighted to think that he was going to get rid of him, and he had the cockshod for him, and when it was done, Hans the Hedgehog got on it and rode away, but took swine and asses with him, which he intended to keep in the forest. When they got there, he made the cock fly on to a high tree with him, and there he sat for many a long year, and watched his asses and swine until the herd was quite large, and his father knew nothing about him. And while he was sitting in the tree, he played his bagpipes and made music, which was very beautiful. Once a king came traveling by who had lost his way and heard the music. He was astonished at it, and he sent his servant forth to look all around and see from whence this music came. He spied about, but he saw nothing but a little animal sitting up aloft on the tree, which looked like a cock with a hedgehog on it, and which made this music. Then the king told the servant he was to ask why he sat there, and if he knew the road which led to his kingdom. So Hans the Hedgehog descended from the tree, and said he would show the way if the king would write a bond and promise him whatever he first met in the royal courtyard as soon as he arrived at home. Then the king thought, "I can easily do that. Hans the Hedgehog understands nothing, and I can write what I like." So the king took pen and ink and wrote something, and when he had done it, Hans the Hedgehog showed him the way, and he got safely home. But his daughter, when she saw him coming from afar, was so overjoyed that she ran to meet him and kissed him. Then he remembered Hans the Hedgehog, and told her what had happened, and that he had been forced to promise whatsoever first met him when he got home to a very strange animal, which sat on a cock as if it were a horse, and made beautiful music. But instead of writing that he should have what he wanted, he had written that he should not have it. Thereupon the princess was glad, and said he had done well, for she never would have gone away with a hedgehog. Hans the Hedgehog, however, looked after his asses and pigs, and was always merry, and sat on the tree and played his bagpipes. Now it came to pass that another king came journeying by with his attendants and runner, and he also had lost his way, and did not know how to get home again because the forest was so large. He likewise heard the beautiful music from a distance, and he asked his runner what that could be, and told him to go and see. Then the runner went under the tree, and saw the cock sitting at the top of it, and Hans the Hedgehog on the cock. The runner asked him what he was doing up there. "I am keeping my asses and my pigs, but what is your desire?" The messenger said that they had lost their way, and could not get back into their own kingdom, and asked if he would not show them the way. Then Hans the Hedgehog descended the tree with the cock, and told the aged king that he would show him the way, if he would give him for his own whatsoever first met him in front of his royal palace. The king said, "Yes!" and he wrote a promise to Hans the Hedgehog that he should have this. That done, Hans rode on before him on the cock and pointed out the way, and the king reached his kingdom again in safety. When he got to the courtyard, there were great rejoicings. Now he had an only daughter who was very beautiful. She ran to meet him, threw her arms around his neck, and was delighted to have her old father back again. She asked him where in the world he had been so long, so he told her how he had lost his way and had very nearly not come back at all, but that as he was traveling through a great forest, a creature, half hedgehog, half man, who was sitting astride a cock in a high tree and making music, had shown him the way and helped him to get out, but that in return he had promised him whatsoever first met him in the royal courtyard, and how that was she herself, which made him unhappy now. But on this, she promised that for the love of her father, she would willingly go with this Hans if he came. Hans the Hedgehog, however, took care of his pigs, and the pigs became more pigs until there were so many in number that the whole forest was filled with them. Then Hans the Hedgehog resolved not to live in the forest any longer, and sent word to his father to have every sty in the village emptied, for he was coming with such a great herd that all might kill who wished to do so. When his father heard that, he was troubled, for he thought Hans the Hedgehog had died long ago. Hans the Hedgehog, however, seated himself on the cock and drove the pigs before him into the village and ordered the slaughter to begin. Ha! Then there was a butchery and a chopping that might have been heard 2 miles off. After this, Hans the Hedgehog said, "Father, let me have the cock shot once more at the forge, and then I will ride away and never come back as long as I live." Then the father had a cock shot once more, and was pleased that Hans the Hedgehog would never return again. Hans the Hedgehog rode away to the first kingdom. There the king had commanded that whosoever came mounted on a cock and had bagpipes with him should be shot at, cut down, or stabbed by everyone, so that he might not enter the palace. When therefore Hans the Hedgehog came riding thither, they all pressed forward against him with their pikes, but he spurred the cock, and it flew up over the gate in front of the king's window and lighted there, and Hans cried that the king must give him what he had promised, or he would take both his life and his daughter's. Then the king began to speak to his daughter, and to beg her to go away with Hans in order to save her own life and her father's. So she dressed herself in white, and her father gave her a carriage with 6 horses, and magnificent attendants together with gold and possessions. She seated herself in the carriage, and placed Hans the Hedgehog beside her with the cock and the bagpipes, and they took leave and drove away, and the king thought he should never see her again. But he was deceived in his expectation, for when they were a short distance from town, Hans the Hedgehog took her pretty clothes off, and pierced her with his hedgehog spikes until she bled all over. "That is the reward of your falseness," said he. "Go your way, I will not have you." And on that he chased her home again, and she was disgraced for the rest of her life. Hans the Hedgehog, however, rode on further on the cock with his bagpipes to the dominions of the second king, to whom he had shown the way. But this one had arranged that if anyone resembling Hans the Hedgehog should come, they were to present arms, give him safe conduct, cry long life to him, and lead him to the royal palace. But when the king's daughter saw him, she was terrified, for he really looked so strange. Then she remembered that she could not change her mind, for she had given her promise to her father. So Hans the Hedgehog was welcomed by her, and married to her, and had to go with her to the royal table, and she seated herself by his side, and they ate and drank. When the evening came, and they wanted to go to sleep, she was afraid of his quills, but he told her she was not to fear, for no harm would befall her. And he told the old king that he was to appoint 4 men to watch by the door of the chamber, and light a great fire, and when he entered the room, and was about to get into bed, he would creep out of his hedgehog skin, and leave it lying there by the bedside, and that the men were to run nimbly to it, throw it into the fire, and stay by it until it was consumed. When the clock struck 11, he went into the chamber, stripped off the hedgehog skin, and left it lying by the bed. Then came the men and fetched it swiftly, and threw it into the fire, and when the fire had consumed it, he was saved, and he lay there in bed in human form, but he was coal-black as if he had been burnt. The king sent for his physician, who washed him with precious salves and anointed him, and he became white, and he was a handsome young man. When the king's daughter saw that, she was glad, and the next morning they arose joyfully, ate and drank, and then the marriage was properly solemnized, and Hans the Hedgehog received the kingdom from the aged king. When several years had passed, he went with his wife to his father and said that he was his son. The father, however, declared he had no son. He had never had but one, and he had been born like a hedgehog with spikes, and had gone forth into the world. Then Hans made himself known, and the old father rejoiced and went with him to his kingdom. My tale is done, and away it has run to little Augusta's house. The Shroud. There was once a mother who had a little boy of 7 years old, who was so handsome and lovable that no one could look at him without liking him, and she herself worshipped him above everything in the world. Now it so happened that he suddenly became ill, and God took him to himself. For this the mother could not be comforted, and wept both day and night. But soon afterwards, when the child had been buried, it appeared by night in the places where it had sat and played during its life, and if the mother wept, it wept also, and when morning came, it disappeared. But as the mother would not stop crying, it came one night in the little white shroud in which it had been laid in its coffin, and with its wreath of flowers round its head, and it stood on the bed at her feet and said, "Oh, mother, do stop crying, or I shall never fall asleep in my coffin, for my shroud will not dry because of all your tears which fall upon it." The mother was afraid when she heard that, and wept no more. The next night the child came again, and he held a little light in his hand, and said, "Look, mother, my shroud is nearly dry, and I can get rest in my grave." Then the mother gave her sorrow into God's keeping, and bore it quietly and patiently, and the child came no more, but slept in its little bed beneath the earth. The Skillful Huntsman. There was once a young fellow who had learnt the trade of locksmith, and told his father he would now go out into the world and seek his fortune. "Very well," said the father, "I am quite content with that," and he gave him some money for his journey. So he traveled about and looked for work. After a time he resolved to not follow the trade of locksmith anymore, for he no longer liked it, but he took a fancy for hunting. Then there met him in his rambles a huntsman dressed in green, who asked whence he came and whither he was going. The youth said he was a locksmith's apprentice, but that the trade no longer pleased him, and he had a liking for huntsmanship. Would he teach it to him? "Oh yes," said the huntsman, "if you will go with me." Then the young fellow went with him, apprenticed himself to him for some years, and learnt the art of hunting. After this he wished to try his luck elsewhere, and the huntsman gave him nothing in the way of payment but an air gun which had this property, that it hit its mark without fail whenever he shot it. Then he set out and found himself in a very large forest, which he could not get to the end of in one day. When evening came, he seated himself in a high tree in order to escape from the wild beasts. Towards midnight it seemed to him as if a tiny little light glimmered in the distance. Then he looked down through the branches towards it, and kept well in his mind where it was. But in the first place he took off his hat and threw it down in the direction of the light, so that he might go down to the hat as a mark when he had descended. He got down and went to his hat, put it on again, and went straight forwards. The further he went, the larger the light grew, and when he got close to it, he saw that it was an enormous fire, and that 3 giants were sitting by it, who had an ox on the spit, and they were roasting it. Presently one of them said, "I must just taste if the meat will soon be fit to eat." And he pulled a piece off, and he was about to put it in his mouth when the huntsman shot it out of his hand. "Well, really," said the giant, "if the wind has not blown the bit out of my hand." And he helped himself to another. But when he was just about to bite into it, the huntsman again shot it away from him. On this, the giant gave the one who was sitting next to him a box on the ear and cried angrily, "Why are you snatching my piece away from me?"
"I haven't snatched it away,"
said the other.
"A sharpshooter must have shot it away from you."
The giant took another piece, but again could not keep it in his hand, for the huntsman shot it out. Then the giant said,
That must be a good shot to shoot the bit out of one's very mouth. Such an one will be useful to us." And he cried aloud, "Come here, you sharpshooter. Seat yourself at the fire beside of us and eat your fill. We will not hurt you, but if you will not come, and we have to bring you by force, then you are a lost man."
On this, the huntsman went up to them and told them he was a skilled huntsman, and that whatever he aimed at with his gun, he was certain to hit. Then they said if he would go with them, he should be well treated, and they told him that outside the forest there was a great lake behind which stood a tower, and in the tower was imprisoned a lovely princess, whom they wished to carry off. "Yes," said he, "I will soon get her for you." Then they added, "But there is still something else. There is a tiny little dog which begins to bark directly at anyone who goes near, and as soon as it barks everyone in the royal palace wakens up, and for this reason we cannot get there. Can you undertake to shoot this dog dead?" "Yes," said he, "that will be quite fun for me." After this he got into a boat and rowed over the lake, and as soon as he landed a little dog came running out, and it was about to bark, but the huntsman took his air gun and shot it dead. When the giants saw that, they rejoiced, thought that they had already had the king's daughter safe, but the huntsman wished first to see how matters stood, and told them that they must stay outside until he called them. Then he went into the castle, and all was perfectly quiet within, and everyone was asleep. When he opened the door of the first room, a sword was hanging on the wall, which was made of pure silver, and there was a golden star on it, the name of the king, and on the table near it laid a sealed letter, which he broke open, and inside of that letter it was written that whosoever had the sword could kill everything which opposed him. So he took the sword from the wall, hung it at his side, and went onwards. Then he entered a room where the king's daughter was lying sleeping, and she was so beautiful that he stood still, and holding his breath, he looked at her. He thought to himself, "How can I give an innocent maiden into the power of the wild giants who have evil in their minds?" He looked about further, and under the bed stood a pair of slippers. On the right one was her father's name with a star, and on the left her own name with a star. She wore also a large scarf of silk embroidered with gold, and on the right side was her father's name, and on the left her own, all in golden letters. Then the huntsman took a pair of scissors and cut the right corner off, and put it in his knapsack, and then he also took the right slipper with the king's name, and thrust that in. Now, the maiden still lay sleeping, and she was quite sewn into her nightdress, and he cut a morsel from this also, and he thrust it with the rest, but he did all without touching her. Then he went forth and left her lying asleep, undisturbed, and when he came to the gate again, the giants were still standing outside, waiting for him, and expecting that he was bringing the princess. He cried to them that they were to come in, for the maiden was already in their power. He could not open the gate to them, but that there was a hole through which they must creep. Then the first approached, and the huntsman wound the giant's hair around his hand, pulled the head in, and cut it off at one stroke with his sword, and then he drew the rest of him in. He called to the second, and cut his head off likewise, and then he killed the third also, and he was well pleased that he had freed the beautiful maiden from her enemies, and he cut out their tongues and put them in his knapsack. Then thought he, "I will go home to my father, and let him see what I have already done, and afterwards I will travel about the world. The luck which God is pleased to grant me will easily find me." But when the king in the castle awoke, he saw the three giants lying there dead, so he went into the sleeping room of his daughter, awoke her, and asked who could have killed the giants. Then said she, "Dear father, I know not. I have been asleep." But when she arose and would have put on her slippers, the right one was gone, and when she looked at her scarf, it was cut, and the right corner was missing. And when she looked at her nightdress, a piece of it was cut out. The king summoned his whole court together, soldiers, and everyone else who was there, and asked who had set his daughter at liberty and killed these giants. Now it happened that he had had a captain, who was one-eyed and a hideous man. Then the old king said that as he had accomplished this, he should marry his daughter. But the maiden said, "Rather than marry him, dear father, I will go away into the world as far as my legs can carry me." But the king said that if she would not marry him, she should take off her royal garments and wear peasant's clothing and go forth, and that she should go to a potter and begin a trade in earthen vessels. So she put off her royal apparel and went to a potter and borrowed crockery enough for her stall, and she promised him also that if she had sold it by the evening she would pay for it. Then the king said she was to seat herself in a corner with it and sell it, and he arranged with some peasants to drive over it with their carts, so that everything should be broken into 1,000 pieces. When therefore the king's daughter had placed her stall in the street, by came the carts and broke all she had into tiny fragments. She began to weep and said, "Alas, how shall I ever pay for the pots now?" The king, however, had wished by this to force her to marry the captain, but instead of that, she again went to the potter and asked him if he would lend to her once more. He said no, she must first pay for what she already had. Then she went to her father and cried and lamented and said she would go forth into the world. Then said he, "I will have a little hut built for you in the forest outside, and in it you shall stay all your life long and cook for everyone, but you shall take no money for it." When the hut was ready, a sign was hung on the door whereon was written, "Today given, tomorrow sold." There she remained for a long time, and it was rumored about the world that a maiden was there who cooked without asking for payment, and that this was set forth on a sign outside of her door. The huntsman heard likewise and thought to himself, "That would suit you. You are poor, you have no money." So he took his air gun and his knapsack, wherein all the things which he had formerly carried away with him from the castle, as tokens of his truthfulness, were still lying, and he went into the forest, and he found the hut with the sign, "Today given, tomorrow sold." He had put on the sword with which he had cut off the heads of the 3 giants, and thus entered the hut, and ordered something to eat to be given to him. He was charmed with the beautiful maiden, who was indeed as lovely as any picture. She asked him whence he had came and whither he was going, and he said, "I am roaming about the world." Then she asked him where he had gotten the sword, for that truly her father's name was on it. He asked her if she were the king's daughter. "Yes," she answered. "With this sword," said he, "I did cut off the heads of 3 giants." And he took their tongues out of his knapsack in proof. Then he also showed her the slipper, and the corner of the scarf, and the piece of the nightdress. Hereupon she was overjoyed, and said that he was the one who had delivered her. On this they went together to the old king, and fetched him to the hut, and she led him into her room, and told him that the huntsman was the man who had really set her free from the giants. And when the aged king saw all of the proofs of this, he could no longer doubt, and said that he was very glad he knew how everything had happened, and that the huntsman should have her to wife, on which the maiden was glad at heart. Then she dressed the huntsman as if he were a foreign lord, and the king ordered a feast to be prepared. When they went to the table, the captain sat on the left side of the king's daughter, but the huntsman was on the right, and the captain thought he was a foreign lord who had come to a visit. When they had eaten and drunk, the old king said to the captain that he would set before him something which he must guess. Supposing someone said that he had killed the 3 giants and were asked where the giants' tongues were, and he were forced to go and look, and there were none in their heads, how could that have happened? The captain said, "Then they cannot have had any." "Not so," said the king. "Every animal has a tongue." And then he likewise asked what punishment should be meted out to anyone who had made such an answer. The captain replied, "He ought to be torn into pieces." Then the king said he had pronounced his own sentence, and the captain was put in prison and then torn into 4 pieces, but the king's daughter was married to the huntsman. After this he brought his father and mother, and they lived with their son in happiness, and after the death of the old king, they received the kingdom. The 2 kings' children. There was once upon a time a king who had a little boy in whose stars it had been foretold that he should likely be killed by a stag when he was 16 years of age. And when he had reached that age, the huntsman once went hunting with him. In the forest, the king's son was separated from the others, and all at once he saw a great stag which he wanted to shoot, but he could not hit. At length he chased the stag so far that they were quite out of the forest, and then suddenly a great tall man was standing there instead of the stag, and it said, "It is well that I have you. I have already ruined 6 pairs of glass skates with running after you, and I have not been able to reach you." Then he took the king's son with him, and dragged him through a great lake to a great palace, and he had to sit down to a table with him and eat something. When they had eaten something together, the king said,
I have 3 daughters. You must keep watch over the eldest for one night, from 9 in the evening till 6 in the morning. And every time the clock strikes, I will come myself and call. And if you then give me no answer, tomorrow morning you shall be put to death. But if you give me an answer, you shall have her to wife. When the young folks went to the bedroom, there stood a stone image of St. Christopher, and the king's daughter said to it,
My father will come at 9 o'clock, and every hour till it strikes 3 when he calls. Give him an answer instead of the king's son. Then the stone image of St. Christopher nodded its head quite quickly, and then more and more slowly, till at last it stood again still. The next morning the king said to him, You have done the business well, but I cannot give my daughter away. You must now watch a night by my second daughter, and then I will consider with myself whether you can have my eldest daughter to wife. But I shall come every hour myself, and when I call you, answer me. And if I call and you do not reply, your blood shall flow. Then they both went into the sleeping room, and there stood a still larger stone image of St. Christopher, and the king's daughter said to it, If my father calls, answer him. Then the great stone image of St. Christopher again nodded its head quite quickly, and then more and more slowly, until at last it stood still again. And the king's son lay down on the threshold, put his hand under his head, and slept. The next morning the king said to him, You have done the business really well, but I cannot give my daughter away. You must now watch a night by the youngest princess, and then I will consider with myself whether you can have my second daughter to wife. But, once again, I shall come every hour myself, and when I call you answer me, and if I call you and you answer not, your blood shall flow from me. Then they once more went to the sleeping room together, and there was a much greater and much taller image of St. Christopher than the 2 first had been. The king's daughter said to it, When my father calls, answer. Then the great tall stone image of St. Christopher nodded quite half an hour with its head, till at length the head stood still again, and the king's son laid himself down on the threshold of the door and slept. The next morning the king said, You have indeed watched well, but I cannot give you my daughter now. I have a great forest. If you cut it down for me between 6 o'clock this morning and 6 at night, I will think about it. Then he gave him a glass axe, a glass wedge, and a glass mallet. When he got into the wood, he began at once to cut, but the axe broke in 2. Then he took the wedge and struck it once with the mallet, and it became as short and small as sand. Then he was much troubled and believed he would have to die, and he sat down and wept. Now when it was noon, the king said, One of you girls must take him something to eat. No, said the 2 eldest. We will not take it to him. The one by whom he last watched can take him something. And then the youngest was forced to go and take him something to eat. When she got into the forest, she asked him how he was getting on. Said he, I'm getting on very badly. Then she said he was to come and just eat a little. Nay, said he, I cannot do that. I have to die anyway, so I will eat no more. Then she spoke so kindly to him and begged him just to try, that he came and ate something. When he had eaten something, she said, I will pick your lice a while, and then you'll feel happier. So she loused him, and he became weary and fell asleep. And then she took her handkerchief and made a knot in it, and struck it 3 times on the earth, and said, Earthworkers, come forth. In a moment, numbers of little earthmen came forth, and asked what the king's daughter commanded. Then said she, In 3 hours' time the great forest must be cut down, and all the wood laid in heaps. So the little earthmen went about and got together the whole of their kindred to help them with their work. They began at once, and when the 3 hours were over, all was done. And then they came back to the king's daughter and told her so. Then she took her white handkerchief again and said, Earthworkers, go home. And at this they all disappeared. When the king's son awoke, he was delighted, and she said, Come home when it has struck 6 o'clock. He did as she told him, and then the king asked, Have you made away with the forest? Yes, said the king's son. When they were sitting at a table, the king said, I cannot yet give you my daughter to wife. You must still do something more for her sake. so he asked what it was to be.
I have a great fish pond, said the king. You must go to it tomorrow morning and clear it of all the mud until it is as bright as a mirror, and then fill it with every kind of fish.
The next morning the king gave him a glass shovel and said,
The fish pond must be done by 6 o'clock.
So he went away. When he came to the fish pond, he stuck a shovel in the mud, and it broke in two. Then he stuck his hoe in the mud, and it broke also. Then he was much troubled. At noon the youngest daughter brought him something to eat, and asked him how he was getting on. The king's son said everything was going very ill with him, and he would certainly have to lose his head. My tools have broken to pieces again.
Oh,
Said she.
you must just come and eat something, and then you will be in another frame of mind.
No, said he. I cannot eat. I'm far too unhappy for that. Then she gave him many good words, until at last he came and ate something. Then she loused him again. He fell asleep, so once more she took her handkerchief, tied a knot in it, and struck the ground thrice with the knot, and said,
Earthworkers, come forth.
In a moment, a great many little earthmen came and asked what she had desired, and she told him that in 3 hours' time they must have the fish pond entirely cleaned out, and it must be so clear that people could see themselves reflected in it, and that every kind of fish must be in it. The little earthmen went away and summoned all their kindred to help them, and in 2 hours it was done. Then they returned to her and said,
We have done as you have commanded.
The king's daughter took the handkerchief and once more struck thrice on the ground with it, and said,
Earthworkers, go home again.
Then they all went away. When the king's son awoke, the fish pond was done. Then the king's daughter went away also, and told him that when it was 6 he was to come to the house. When he arrived at the house, the king asked,
Have you got the fish pond done?
Yes, said the king's son. That was all very good. When they were again sitting at the table, the king said,
You have certainly done the fish pond, but I cannot give my daughter to you yet. You must just do one thing more.
Well, what is that then? Asked the king's son. The king said he had a great mountain on which there was nothing but briars, which all must be cut down, and at the top of it the youth must build a great castle, which must be as strong as could be conceived, and all the furniture and fittings belonging to a castle must be inside of it. And when he arose the next morning, the king gave him a glass axe and a glass gimlet, and he was to have all done by 6 o'clock. As he was cutting down the briar patch with the axe, it broke off short, and so small that the pieces flew all around about, and he could not use the gimlet either. Then he was quite miserable, and he waited for his dearest to see if she would not come to help him in his need. When it was midday, she came and brought him something to eat. He went to meet her and told her all, and he ate something, and he let her louse him, and he fell asleep. Then she once more took the knot and struck the earth with it, and said,
Earthworkers, come forth.
Then came once again numbers of earthmen, and asked what her desire was. Then said she,
In the space of 3 hours you must cut down the whole of the briars, and a castle must be built on the top of the mountain that must be as strong as anyone could conceive, and all the furniture that pertains to a castle must also be inside of it.
They went away and summoned their kindred to help them, and when the time was come, all was ready. Then they came to the king's daughter and told her so, and the king's daughter took her handkerchief and struck thrice on the earth with it and said,
Earthworkers, go home.
On which they all disappeared. When therefore the king's son awoke and saw everything done, he was as happy as a bird in the air. When it had struck 6, they went home together. Then said the king,
Is the castle ready?
Yes, said the king's son. When they sat down at table, the king said,
I cannot give away my youngest daughter until the 2 eldest are married.
And then the king's son and the king's daughter were quite troubled, and the king's son had no idea what to do. But he went by night to the king's daughter and ran away with her. When they had got a little distance away, the king's daughter peeped around and saw her father behind her.
Oh,
Said she,
what are we to do? My father is behind us and will take us back with him. I will at once change you into a briar and myself into a rose, and I will shelter myself in the midst of the bush.
When the father reached the place, there stood a briar with one rose on it, and he was about to gather the rose. when the thorn pricked his finger so that he was forced to go home again. His wife asked why he had not brought their daughter back with him, so he said he had nearly got up to her, but that all at once he had lost sight of her, and a briar with one rose was growing on the spot. Then said the queen,
"If you had but gathered the rose, the briar would have been forced to come too."
So he went back again to fetch the rose, but in the meantime the two were already far over the plain, and the king ran after them. Then the daughter once more looked around and saw her father coming, and said,
"Oh, what shall we do now? I will instantly change you into a church and myself into a priest, and I will stand up in the pulpit and preach."
When the king got to the palace, there stood the church, and in the pulpit was a priest preaching. So he listened to the sermon, and then went home again. Then the queen asked why he had not brought their daughter with him, and he said,
"Nay, I ran a long time after her, and just as I thought I should soon overtake her, a church was standing there, and a priest was in the pulpit preaching."
"You should have just brought the priest,"
said the wife.
"and then the church would have soon come too. It is no use to send you. I must go there myself."
When she had walked for some time and could see the two in the distance, the king's daughter peeped round and saw her mother coming, and said,
"Now we are undone, for my mother is coming herself. I will immediately change you into a fish pond and turn myself into a fish."
When the mother came to the place, there was a large fish pond, and in the midst of it a fish was leaping about and peeping out of the water, and it was quite merry. She wanted to catch the fish, but she could not. Then she was very angry and drank up the whole pond in order to catch the fish, but it made her so ill that she was forced to vomit, and she vomited the whole pond out again. Then she cried,
"I see very well that nothing can be done now,"
and she asked them to come back to her. Then the king's daughter went back again, and the queen gave her daughter 3 walnuts and said,
"With these you can help yourself when you're in your greatest need."
So the young folks once more went away together, and when they had walked quite 10 miles, they arrived at a castle from whence the king's son came, and near it was a village. When they reached it, the king's son said, "Stay here, my dearest. I will just go to the castle, and then I will come with a carriage and with attendants to fetch you." When he got back to the castle, they all rejoiced greatly at having the king's son back again, and he told them he had a bride who was now in the village, and they must go with the carriage to fetch her. Then they harnessed the horses at once, and many attendants seated themselves outside of the carriage. When the king's son was about to get in, his mother gave him a kiss, and he forgot everything which had happened, and also what he was about to do. At this, his mother ordered the horses to be taken out of the carriage again, and everyone went back into the house. But the maiden sat in the village and watched, and thought he would come and fetch her, but no one came. Then the king's daughter took service in the mill which belonged to the castle, and was obliged to sit by the pond every afternoon and clean the tubs. And the queen came one day on foot from the castle, and went walking by the pond, and saw the well-grown maiden sitting there, and said,
"What a fine strong girl that is! She pleases me well."
Then she and all with her looked at the maid, but no one knew her. So a long time passed by, during which the maiden served the miller honorably and faithfully. In the meantime, the queen had sought a wife for her son, who came from a quite distant part of the world. When the bride came, they were at once to be married, and many people hurried together, all of whom wanted to see everything. And then the girl said to the miller that he might be so good as to give her leave to go also. So the miller said,
"Yeah, do go there."
And when she was about to go, she opened one of the 3 walnuts, and a beautiful dress lay inside of it. She put it on, and she went into the church and stood by the altar. Suddenly came the bride and bridegroom, and seated themselves before the altar. And when the priest was just going to bless them, the bride peeped half around and saw the maiden standing there. Then she stood up again. She said she would not be given away until she had also had such a beautiful dress as that lady there. So they went back to the house again, and sent to ask the lady if she would sell that dress. No, indeed she would not sell it, but the bride might perhaps earn it. Then the bride asked her how she was to do this. The maiden said that if she might sleep one night outside the king's son's door, the bride might have what she wanted. So the bride said,
"Yes, I am willing to do that."
But the servants were ordered to give the king's son a sleeping draught. And then the maiden laid herself down on the threshold, lamented all night long. She had had the forest cut down for him. She had had the fish pond cleaned for him. She had had the castle built for him. She had changed him into a briar, and then into a church, and at last into a fish pond, and yet he had forgotten her so quickly. The king's son did not hear one word of it, but the servants had been awakened, and they had listened to all of it, and had not known what it could mean. The next morning, when they were all up, the bride put on the dress, and went away to the church with the bridegroom. In the meantime, the maiden opened the second walnut, and a still more beautiful dress was inside of it. She put it on, and went and stood by the altar in the church, and everything happened as it had happened the time before. And the maiden again lay all night on the threshold which led her to the chamber of the king's son, and the servant was once more to give him a sleeping draught. The servant, however, went to him and gave him something to keep him awake, and then the king's son went to bed, and the miller's maiden bemoaned herself as before on the threshold of the door, and told of all that she had done. All this the king's son heard, and was sore troubled, and what was past had come back to him. Then he wanted to go to her, but his mother had locked the door. The next morning, however, he went at once to his beloved, and told her everything which had happened to him, and he prayed her not to be angry with him for having forgotten her. Then the king's daughter opened the third walnut, and within it was still a more magnificent dress, which she put on, and went with her bridegroom to church. And numbers of children came who gave them flowers and offered them gay ribbons to bind about their feet, and they were blessed by the priest and had a merry wedding. But the false mother and the bride had to depart, and the mouth of the person who last told all of this is still quite warm. The Cunning Little Tailor. There was once upon a time a princess who was extremely proud. If a wooer came, she gave him some riddle to guess, and if he could not guess it, he was sent contemptuously away. She let it be made known also that whoever solved her riddle should marry her, let him be who he might. At length, 3 tailors fell in with each other, the 2 eldest of whom thought they had done so many dexterous jobs of work successfully that they could not fail to succeed in this also. The third was a little useless harum-scarum who did not even know his trade, but thought he must have some luck in this venture, for where else was it to come from? The 2 others said to him, "Just stay at home. You cannot do much with your little understanding." The little tailor, however, did not let himself be discouraged, and he said that he had set his mind to work on this for once, and he would manage well enough, and he went forth as if the whole world were his. They all 3 announced themselves to the princess, and said that she was to propound her riddle to them, and that the right persons were now come, who had understanding so fine that they could have threaded in a needle. Then said the princess,
"I have 2 kinds of hair on my head. Of what color is it?"
"Well, if that be all," said the first, "it must be black and white, like the cloth which is called pepper and salt." The princess said,
"Wrongly guessed. Let the second answer."
Then said the second, "Well, if it not be black and white, then it is brown and red, like my father's Sunday coat."
"Wrongly guessed," said the princess. "Let the third give the answer, for I see very well he knows it for certain."
Then the little tailor stepped boldly forth and said,
"The princess has a silver and golden hair on her head, and those are the 2 different colors."
When the princess heard that, she turned pale and nearly fell down with terror, for the little tailor had guessed her riddle, and she had firmly believed that no man on earth could discover it. When her courage returned, she said,
"You have not won me yet by that. There is still something else which you must do. Below, in the stable, is a bear with which you shall pass the night, and when I get up in the morning, if you are still alive, you shall marry me."
She expected, however, she would thus get rid of the tailor, for the bear had never yet left anyone alive who had fallen into its clutches. The little tailor did not let himself be frightened away, but was quite delighted and said,
"Boldly ventured is half won."
So when the evening came, our little tailor was taken down to the bear. The bear was about to set on the little fellow at once and gave him a hearty welcome with his paws.
"Softly, softly," said the little tailor. I will soon make you quiet."
Then quite composedly, and as if he had no anxiety in the world, he took some nuts out of his pocket, cracked them, and ate the kernels. When the bear saw that, he was seized with the desire to have some nuts too. The tailor felt in his pockets and reached him a handful. They were, however, not nuts, but pebbles. The bear put them in his mouth, but could not get nothing out of them, let him bite as he would.
Thought he, what a stupid blockhead am I. I cannot even crack a nut. And then he said to the tailor, "Here, crack me the nuts."
"There, see what a stupid fellow you are," said the little tailor, "to have such a great mouth and not be able to crack a small little nut."
Then he took the pebble and nimbly put a nut in his mouth in the place of it, and crack, it was in two.
"I must try the thing again," said the bear. "When I watch you, I then think I ought to be able to do it too."
So the tailor once more gave him a pebble, and the bear tried and tried to bite into it with all the strength of his body, but even you must not believe that he had managed it. When that was over, the tailor took out a violin from beneath his coat and played something to himself. When the bear heard the music, he could not help but beginning to dance, and when he had danced a while, the thing pleased him so well that he had said to the little tailor,
"Listen, is it difficult to fiddle?"
"Well, easy enough for a child. Look, with the left hand I lay my fingers on it, and with the right I stroke it with the bow, and then it goes merrily. Apsa vivalera."
"So," said the bear, "fiddling is a thing I should like to learn too, that I might dance whenever I felt like it. What do you think of that? Will you give me lessons?"
"With all my heart," said the tailor, "if you have a talent for it. But just let me see your claws. They are terribly long. I must cut your nails a little." Then a vice was brought, and the bear put his claws in it, and the little tailor screwed it tight and said, "Now wait until I come with the scissors." And he let the bear growl as he liked, and lay down in the corner of a bundle of straw, and fell asleep. When the princess heard the bear growling so fiercely during the night, she believed nothing else but that he was growling for joy, and that he had made an end of the tailor. In the morning she arose careless and happy, but when she peeped into the stable, the tailor stood gaily before her, and he was as healthy as a fish in water. Now she could not say another word against the wedding, because she had given a promise before everyone, and the king ordered a carriage to be brought in which she was to drive to the church with the tailor, and there she was to be married. When they had climbed into the carriage, the two other tailors, who had false hearts and envied him in his good fortune, went into the stable and unscrewed the bear again. The bear, in a great fury, ran after the carriage. The princess heard the snorting and growling. She was terrified, and she cried,
"Ah, the bear is behind us and wants to get you."
The tailor was quick and stood on his head, stuck his legs out of the window, and cried,
"Do you see the vice? If you do not, be off, or you shall be put into it again."
When the bear saw that, he turned around and ran away. The tailor drove quietly to the church, and the princess was married to him at once, and he lived with her as happy as a woodlark. Whosoever does not believe this must pay me a tailor. The bright sun brings it to light. A tailor's apprentice was traveling about the world in search of work, and at one time he could find none, and his poverty was so great that he had not a farthing to live on. Presently he met a man on the road, and as he thought he would have a great deal of money about him, the tailor thrust God out of his heart, fell on the man, and said,
"Give me your money, or I will strike you dead."
Then said the man,
"Grant me my life. I have no money but 8 farthings.
But the tailor said,
"Money you have, and it shall be produced."
And he used violence to beat on him until he was near death. And when the man was dying, the last words he said were,
"The bright sun will bring it to light."
And thereupon he died. The tailor's apprentice felt in his pockets and sought for money, but he found nothing but 8 farthings, just as the man had said. Then he took him up and carried him behind a clump of trees and went onwards to seek work. After he had traveled about a long while, he found work in a town with a master who had a pretty daughter and with whom he fell in love, and he married her and lived in good and happy wedlock. After a long time, when he and his wife had had 2 children, the wife's father and mother died, and the young people kept house alone. One morning, when the husband was sitting on the table before the window, his wife brought him his coffee, and when he had poured it out into the saucer and was just going to drink, the sun shone on it, and the reflection glimmered hither and thither on the wall above, and made circles on it. Then the tailor looked up and said, "Yes, it would like very much to bring it to light, and cannot." The woman said,
"Oh, dear husband, and what is that then? What do you mean by that?"
He answered, "Well, I must not tell you." But she said,
"If you love me, you must tell me."
and she used her most affectionate words and said that no one should ever know it, and left him no rest. Then he told her how years ago, when he was traveling about seeking work and quite worn out and penniless, he had killed a man, and that in the last agonies of death the man had spoken the word, "The bright sun will bring it to light." And now the sun had just wanted to bring it to light, and had gleamed and made circles on the wall, but had not been able to do it. After this, he again charged her particularly never to tell this, or he would lose his life, and she did promise. However, when he had sat down to work again, she went to her great friend and confided the story to her, and asked her never to repeat it to any human being. But before 3 days were over, the whole town knew it, and the tailor was brought to trial and condemned. And thus, after all, the bright sun did bring it to light. The Blue Light. There was once on a time a soldier who for many years had served the king faithfully, but when the war came to an end could serve no longer because of the many wounds which he had received. The king said to him, "You may return to your home. I need you no longer, and you will not receive any more money, for he only receives wages who renders me their services." Then the soldier did not know how to earn a living, and went away greatly troubled, and walked the whole day, until in the evening he entered a forest. When the darkness came on, he saw a light, which he went up to, and came to a house wherein lived a witch. "Do give me 1 night's lodging, and a little to eat and drink," said he to her, "or I shall starve."
"Oh," she answered,
Who gives anything to a runaway soldier? Yet will I be compassionate and take you in, if you will do what I wish."
"Well, what do you wish?" said the soldier.
"That you should dig all around my garden for me tomorrow."
The soldier consented, and next day labored with all of his strength, but could not finish it by the evening.
"I see well enough," said the witch, "that you can do no more today, but I will keep you yet another night, in payment for which you must tomorrow chop me a load of wood, and chop it small."
The soldier spent the whole day in doing it, and in the evening the witch proposed that he should stay 1 more night.
"Tomorrow you shall only do me a very trifling piece of work. Behind my house there is an old dry well, into which my light has fallen. It burns blue, and it never goes out, and you shall bring it up again."
The next day the old woman took him to the well, and let him down in a basket. He found the blue light, and made her a signal to draw him up again. She did draw him up, but when he came near the edge, she stretched down her hand and wanted to take the blue light away from him. "No," said he, perceiving her evil intention, "I will not give you the light until I am standing with both feet upon the ground." The witch fell into a passion. She let him fall again into the well, and she walked away. The poor soldier fell without injury onto the moist ground, and the blue light went on burning. But of what use was that to him? He saw very well that he could not escape death. He sat for a while, very sorrowfully. Then suddenly he felt in his pocket and found his tobacco pipe, which was still half full. "This shall be my last pleasure," thought he. He pulled it out, lit it at the blue light, and began to smoke. When the smoke had circled about the cavern, suddenly a little black dwarf stood before him and said,
"Lord, what are your commands?"
"What my commands are?" replied the soldier, quite astonished.
"I must do everything you bid me," said the little man.
"Good," said the soldier. "Then in the first place, help me out of this well." The little man took him by the hand and led him through an underground passage, but he did not forget to take the blue light with him. On the way, the dwarf showed him the treasures which the witch had collected and hidden there, and the soldier took as much gold as he could carry. When he was above, he said to the little man, "Now, go and bind the old witch, and carry her before the judge." In a short time, she came by like the wind, riding on a wild tomcat and screaming frightfully. Nor was it long before the little man reappeared.
"It is all done," said he, "and the witch is already hanging on the gallows. What further commands has my lord?"
inquired the dwarf. "At this moment, none," answered the soldier. "You can return home. Only be at hand immediately if I summon you."
"Nothing more is needed than that you should light your pipe at the blue light, and I will appear before you at once."
Thereupon he vanished from his sight. The soldier returned to the town from which he had come. He went to the best inn, ordered himself handsome clothes, and then bade the landlord furnish him a room as handsome as possible. When it was ready and the soldier had taken possession of it, he summoned the little black mannequin and said, "I have served the king faithfully, but he has dismissed me and left me to hunger, and now I want to take my revenge."
"What am I to do?" asked the little man.
"Late at night when the king's daughter is in bed, bring her here and sleep. She shall do servant's work for me." The mannequin said,
"That is an easy thing for me to do, but a very dangerous thing for you, for if it is discovered, you will fare ill."
When 12 o'clock had struck, the door sprang open, and the mannequin carried in the princess. "Aha! Are you there?" cried a soldier. "Get to your work at once. Fetch the broom and sweep the chamber." When she had done this, he ordered her to come to his chair, and then he stretched out his feet and said, "Pull off my boots." And then he threw them in her face, and he made her pick them up again and clean and brighten them. She, however, did everything he bade her without opposition, silently and with half-shut eyes. When the first cock crowed, the mannequin carried her back to the royal palace and laid her in her bed. The next morning, when the princess arose, she went to her father and told him that she had a very strange dream.
"I was carried through the streets with the rapidity of lightning," said she, "and taken into a soldier's room, and I had to wait upon him like I was a servant. I had to sweep his room, I had to clean his boots, and do all kinds of menial work. It was only a dream, and yet I am just as tired as if I had really done everything."
"The dream may have been true," said the king. "I will give you a piece of advice. Fill your pocket full of peas and make a small hole in the pocket, and then, if you are carried away again, they will fall out and leave a track in the streets." But unseen by the king, the mannequin was standing beside him when he said that, and he heard it all. At night, when the sleeping princess was again carried through the streets, some peas certainly did fall out of her pocket, but they made no track, for the crafty mannequin had just before scattered peas in every street there was, and again the princess was compelled to do servant's work until the cock crow. The next morning the king sent his people out to seek the track, but it was all in vain, for in every street poor children were sitting, picking up peas and saying,
"It must have rained peas last night."
"We must think of something else," said the king. "Keep your shoes on when you go to bed, and before you come back from the place where you are taken, hide one of them there. I will soon contrive to find it." The black mannequin heard the plot, and at night, when the soldier again ordered him to bring the princess, he revealed it to him, and told him that he knew of no expedient to counteract this stratagem, and that if the shoes were found in the soldier's house, it would go badly for him. "Do what I bid you," replied the soldier, and again, this third night, the princess was obliged to work like a servant, but before she went away, she hid her shoe under the bed. Next morning, the king had the entire town searched for his daughter's shoe. It was found at the soldier's, and the soldier himself, who at the entreaty of the dwarf had gone outside of the gate, was soon brought back and thrown into prison. In his flight, he had forgotten the most valuable things he had, the blue light and the gold, and he had only one ducat in his pocket. And now, loaded with chains, he was standing at the window of his dungeon when he chanced to see one of his comrades passing by. The soldier tapped at the pane of glass, and when this man came up, he said to him,
"Be so kind as to fetch me that small bundle I have lying in the inn, and I will give you a ducat for doing it."
His comrade ran thither and brought him what he wanted. As soon as the soldier was alone again, he lighted his pipe and summoned the black mannequin.
"Have no fear,"
said the latter to his master.
"Go wheresoever they take you, and let them do what they will. Only take the blue light with you."
The next day the soldier was tried, and though he had done nothing wicked, the judge condemned him to death. When he was led forth to die, he begged the last favor of the king.
"What is it?" asked the king.
"I wish to smoke my pipe one more time on the way."
"You may smoke 3, answered the king, "but do not imagine that I will spare your life."
Then the soldier pulled out his pipe and lighted it at the blue light, and as soon as a few wreaths of smoke had ascended, the mannequin was there with a small cudgel in his hand and said,
"What does my lord command?"
"Strike down to earth that false judge there, and his constable, and spare not the king who has treated me so ill." Then the mannequin fell on them like lightning, darting this way and that, and whosoever was so much as touched by his cudgel fell to earth, and did not venture to stir again. The king was terrified. He threw himself on the soldier's mercy, and merely to be allowed to live at all, gave the soldier his kingdom for his own, and gave the soldier his daughter to wife. The Willful Child. Once upon a time, there was a child who was willful, and would not do what her mother wished. For this reason, God had no pleasure in her, and let her become ill, and no doctor could do her any good, and in a short time she lay on her deathbed. When she had been lowered into her grave, and the earth was spread over her, all at once her arm came out again, stretched upwards. And when they had put it in and spread fresh earth over it, it was all to no purpose, for the arm always came out again. Then the mother herself was obliged to go to the grave and strike the arm with a rod, and when she had done that, it was drawn in, and then at last the child had rest beneath the ground. The Old Woman in the Wood. A poor servant girl was once traveling with the family with which she was in service through a great forest, and when they were in the midst of it, robbers came out of the thicket and murdered all they found. All perished together except for the girl, who had jumped out of the carriage in a fright and hidden herself behind a tree. When the robbers had gone away with their booty, she came out and beheld the great disaster. Then she began to weep bitterly and said,
"What can a poor girl like me do now? I do not know how to get out of the forest. No human being lives in it, so I must certainly starve."
She walked about and looked for a road, but could find none. When it was evening, she seated herself under a tree, gave herself into God's keeping, and resolved to sit waiting there and not go away, let happen what might. When she had sat there for a while, a white dove came flying to her with a little golden key in its beak, and put the little key into her hand and said,
"Do you see that great tree? Therein is a little lock. Open it with the tiny key, and you will find food enough and suffer no more hunger."
Then she went to the tree and opened it, and found milk in a little dish, and white bread to break into it, so that she could eat her fill. When she was satisfied, she said,
"It is now time when the hens at home go to roost. I am so tired I could go to bed too."
Then the dove flew over to her again and brought her another golden key in its bill and said,
"Open that tree there, and you will find the bed."
So she opened it. She found a beautiful white bed, and she prayed God to protect her during the night, and lay down and slept. In the morning the dove came for a third time, and again brought a little key and said,
"Open that tree there, and you will find clothes."
and when she opened it, she found garments beset with gold and with jewels, more splendid than those of any king's daughter. So she lived there for some time, and the dove came every day and provided her with all she needed, and it was a quiet, good life. Then one day the dove came and said,
"Will you do something for my sake?" "With all my heart,"
said the girl. Then said the little dove,
"I will guide you to a small house. Enter it, and inside it, an old woman will be sitting by the fire and will say, 'Good day.' But on your life, give her no answer. Let her do what she will, but pass by her on the right side. Further on, there is a door which open, and you will enter into a room where a quantity of rings of all kinds are lying, amongst which are some magnificent ones with shining stones. Leave them, however, where they are, and seek out a plain one, which must likewise be amongst them, and bring it here to me as quickly as you can."
The girl went to the little house and came to the door. There sat an old woman who stared when she saw her and said,
"Good day, my child."
and the girl gave her no answer and opened the door.
"Whither away?"
cried the old woman, and seized her by the gown, and wanted to hold her fast, saying,
"That is my house. No one can go in there if I choose not to allow it."
But the girl was silent. She got away from her and went straight into the room. Now there lay on the table an enormous quantity of rings, which gleamed and glittered before her eyes. She turned them over and looked for the plain one, but could not find it. While she was seeking, she saw the old woman and how she was stealing away, and wanting to go off with a bird cage which she had in her hand. So she went after her and took the cage out of her hand, and when she raised it up and looked into it, a bird was inside, which had a plain ring upon its bill. Then she took the ring and ran quite joyously home with it, and thought that the little white dove would come and get the ring, but it did not. Then she leaned against a tree, determined to wait for the dove. As she thus stood, it seemed just as if the tree was soft and pliant, and was letting its branches down, and suddenly the branches twined around her and were two arms, and when she looked around, the tree was a handsome man who embraced and kissed her heartily and said, "You have delivered me from the power of the old woman, who is a wicked witch. She had changed me into a tree, and every day for 2 hours I was a white dove, and so long as she possessed the ring, I could not regain my human form." Then his servants and his horses, who had likewise been changed into trees, were freed from the enchanter also, and stood beside him. And thus he led them forth to his kingdom, for he was a king's son, and they were married, and they lived happily. The King's Son Who Feared Nothing. There was once a king's son who was no longer content to stay at home in his father's house, and as he had no fear of anything, he thought, "I will go forth into the wide world. There the time will not seem long to me, and I shall see the wonders enough." So he took leave of his parents, and he went forth, and on from morning till night, and whichever way his path led, it was just the same to him. It came to pass that he arrived at the house of a giant, and as he was so tired, he sat down by the door and rested. And as he let his eyes roam here and there, he saw the giant's playthings lying in the yard. These were a couple of enormous balls, and 9 pins as tall as a man. After a while, he had a fancy to set the 9 pins up, and then rolled the balls at them, and he screamed and cried out when the 9 pins fell, and he had a merry time of it. The giant heard the noise, stretched his head out of the window, and saw a man who was not taller than other men, and yet he played with his 9 pins.
"Little worm," cried he, "why are you playing with my balls? Who gave you the strength to do it?"
The king's son looked up and saw the giant and said, "Oh, you blockhead, you think indeed that you only have strong arms. I can do everything I want to do." The giant came down and watched the bowling with great admiration and said,
"Child of man, if you are one of that kind, go and bring me an apple of the tree of life."
"What do you want with it?" said the king's son.
"I do not want the apple for myself," answered the giant, "but I have a betrothed bride who wishes for it. I have traveled far about the world and cannot find the tree."
"Well, I soon will find it," said the king's son, "and I do not know what is to prevent me from getting the apple down." The giant said,
"You really believe it to be so easy? The garden in which the tree stands is surrounded by an iron railing, and in front of the railing lie wild beasts, each close to the other, and they keep watch and let no man go in."
"They will be sure to let me in," said the king's son.
"Yes, but even if you do get into the garden and see the apple hanging to the tree, it is still not yours. A ring hangs in front of it, through which anyone who wants to reach the apple and break it off must put his hand, and no one has yet had the luck to do it."
"Well, that luck surely will be mine," said the king's son. And then he took leave of the giant and went forth over the mountain and valley and through the plains and forests, until at length he came to the wondrous garden. The beasts lay around it, but they had put their heads down and were asleep. Moreover, they did not wake when he went up to them, so he stepped over them, climbed the fence, and got safely into the garden. There, in the middle of it, stood the tree of life, and the red apples were shining upon the branches. He climbed up the trunk to the top, and as he was about to reach out for an apple, he saw a ring hanging before it, but he thrust his hand through that without any difficulty, and he picked the apple off of the tree. The ring closed tightly on his arm, and all at once he felt a prodigious strength flowing through his veins. When he had come down again from the tree with the apple, he would not climb over the fence, but grasped the great gate, and had no need to shake it more than once before it sprang open with a loud crash. Then he went out, and the lion, which had been lying in front of the gate, was awake and sprang after him, not in a rage and fierceness, but following him humbly as his master. The king's son took the giant the apple he had promised him, and he said, "You see, I have brought it without difficulty." The giant was glad that his desire had been so soon satisfied, hastened to his bride, and gave her the apple for which she had wished. She was a beautiful and wise maiden, and as she did not see the ring on his arm, she said, "I shall never believe that you have brought the apple until I see the ring on your arm." The giant said,
"I have nothing to do but go home and fetch it,"
and thought it would be easy to take away by force from the weak man what he would not give of his own free will. He therefore demanded the ring from him, but the king's son refused it.
"Where the apple is, the ring must be also," said the giant. "If you will not give it of your own accord, you must fight me for it."
They wrestled with each other for a long time, but the giant could not harm the king's son, who was strengthened by the magical power of the ring. Then the giant thought of a ruse and said,
"I have got warm with fighting, and so have you. We will bathe in the river and cool ourselves before we begin again."
The king's son, who knew nothing of falsehood, went with him to the water, and pulled off with his clothes the ring also from his arm, and sprang into the river. The giant instantly snatched the ring and ran away with it, but the lion, which had observed the theft, pursued the giant, tore the ring out of his hand, and brought it back to its master. Then the giant placed himself behind an oak tree, and while the king's son was busy putting his clothes on again, he surprised him, and put out both of his eyes. And now the unhappy king's son stood there and was blind and knew not how to help himself. Then the giant came back to him, took him by the hand as if he were someone who wanted to guide him, and led him to the top of a high rock. There he left him standing and thought,
"Just 2 steps more, and he will fall down and kill himself. Then I can take the ring from him."
But the faithful lion had not deserted its master. It held him fast by the clothes and drew him gradually back from the ledge again. When the giant came and wanted to rob the dead man, he saw that his cunning had been in vain.
"Is there no way, then, of destroying a weak child of man like that?"
he said angrily to himself, and he seized the king's son and led him back again to the precipice by another way. But the lion, which saw his evil design, helped its master out of danger here also. When they had come close to the edge, the giant let the blind man's hand drop, and was going to leave him behind alone, but the lion pushed the giant so that he was thrown down and fell, dashed to pieces on the ground. The faithful animal again drew its master back from the precipice, and guided him to a tree by which flowed a clear brook. The king's son sat down there, but the lion lay down and sprinkled the water in his face with its paws. Scarcely had a couple of drops wetted the sockets of his eyes than he was once more able to see something, and noticed a little bird flying quite close by, which hid itself against the trunk of a tree. So it went down to the water and bathed itself therein, and then it soared upward and swept between the trees without touching them, as if it had recovered its sight. Then the king's son had recognized a sign from God, and stooped down to the water, and washed and bathed his face in it. And when he arose, he had his eyes once more, brighter and clearer than they had ever been. The king's son thanked God for his great mercy, and traveled with his lion onwards through the world. And it came to pass that he arrived before a castle which was enchanted. In the gateway stood a maiden of beautiful form and fine in face, but she was quite black. She spoke to him and said,
"Ah, if you could but deliver me from the evil spell which is thrown over me."
"What shall I do?" said the king's son. The maiden answered,
"You must pass 3 nights in the great hall of this enchanted castle, but you must let no fear enter your heart. When they are doing their worst to torment you, if you bear it without letting a sound escape you, I shall be free. Your life they dare not take."
Then said the king's son, "I have no fear. With God's help I will try it." So he went gaily into the castle, and when it grew dark he seated himself in the large hall and waited. Everything was quiet, however, until midnight, when all at once a great tumult began, and out of every hole and corner came little devils. They behaved as if they did not see him, seated themselves in the middle of the room, lighted a fire, and began to gamble. When one of them lost, he said,
"It's not right. Someone is here who does not belong to us. It is his fault that I am losing." "Wait, you fellow behind the stove. I am coming," said another.
The screaming became still louder, so that no one could have heard it without terror. The king's son stayed sitting quite calmly and was not afraid, but at last the devils jumped up from the ground and fell on him, and there were so many of them that he could not defend himself from them. They dragged him about on the floor, pinched him, pricked him, beat him, and tormented him, but no sound escaped from him. Towards morning they disappeared, and he was so exhausted that he could scarcely move his limbs, but when day dawned the black maiden came to him. She bore in her hand a little bottle wherein was a water of life, wherewith she washed him, and at once he felt all pain depart and new strength flow through his veins. She said,
"You have held out successfully for 1 night, but 2 more lie before you."
Then she went away again, and as she was going, he observed that her feet had become white. The next night the devils came and began their gambling anew. They fell on the king's son and beat him much more severely than the night before, until his body was covered with wounds. But as he bore all quietly, they were forced to leave him, and when dawn appeared, the maiden came and healed him with the water of life. And when she went away, he saw with joy that she had already become white to the tips of her fingers. And now he had only 1 more night to go through, but it was the worst. The devils came again.
"Are you still there?" cried they. "You shall be tormented till your breath stops."
They pricked him and beat him and threw him here and there, and pulled him by his arms and legs as if they wanted to tear him to pieces, but he bore everything and never uttered a cry. At last the devils vanished, but he lay fainting there and did not stir, nor could he raise his eyes to look at the maiden who came in and sprinkled and bathed him in the water of life. But suddenly he was free from all pain and felt fresh and healthy, as if he had awakened from sleep. And when he opened his eyes, he saw the maiden standing by him, snow white and fair as day.
"Rise," said she, "and swing your sword 3 times over the stairs, and then all will be delivered."
And when he had done that, the whole castle was released from enchantment, and the maiden was a rich king's daughter. And the servants came and said that the table was set in a great hall, and dinner served up. Then they sat down and ate and drank together, and in the evening their wedding was solemnized with great rejoicings. Thank you again for checking out another installment of the Grimm's Fairy Tales series. We hope you're enjoying yourself with these. There's plenty more to come. Thank you for all the support. Thank you for liking. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for sharing. Sweet dreams.